Hello, I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley.
And I'm her daughter, Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Heidi and I want to welcome you to Open to Hope Conversations, the podcast.
We believe that the greatest gift you can give yourself after a loss is hope, using this moment to connect with others who have not only survived but thrived.
So let's get started. Welcome to the Open to Hope show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Well, Heidi, we've got somebody on today that you'll be introducing, and she is an expert on family and grief, and we're going to be talking about when a family grieves, because I know that's a big issue of a lot of the audience, how we do that with the families and what we can expect.
Absolutely, Mom. And our guest today works a lot with bereaved families. And in fact, I spoke in one of her groups, which was really great. And her name is Jessica Elder. And Jessica is a bereavement manager for the Children's Brain Tumor Foundation. She is a therapist for Revive Counseling and Wellness Center in Scottsdale, Arizona. And she graduated from Columbia University School of Social Work, where I graduated from also. So welcome to the show, Jessica.
Thank you, Heidi.
Great having you on today. You had a miscarriage, your first child, right? You have 4 kids.
Yes.
3, 5, 7, and 9. You're in the mix, aren't you?
Yeah, back in 2012 was probably, I've had other losses before, but that was my most significant loss. And, I was 11 weeks along and it was my first pregnancy. And, I was very familiar with miscarriage based on supporting other people and hearing about it, but it was my first really personal experience with it. And although it's very different than the type of loss that I work with, it definitely gave me, more insight and more personal experience in terms of being able to support other people and understanding certain aspects of grief.
Yeah, it really hits you when it happens to you. I
Yes.
thought I was kind of an expert in grief and loss when Scott was killed, and actually taught it, and I was a nurse and covered a surgical service, and wow, when it happened to me, it's like, whoa, woody whoa. So
It's very different. Yep.
yeah.
And I would think, Jessica, I also had a miscarriage and my heart goes out to you. And I've had 2. Having the miscarriage first, I would think that when you got pregnant the second time around, and I know you have 4 kids now, it would be very anxiety provoking. I'm wondering if you were worried and thought, what if I lose this pregnancy?
It was very, very anxiety provoking. And at the same time, I do think I was able to just kind of, realize that there's certain things that I can't control. But of course, I thought about it all of the time. And my doctors actually made me feel really good, though. They told me that if I was ever nervous, I could come in, they would check me. Just they gave me a lot of reassurance. They checked my blood work more often, and that definitely helped. But, I do know people who've suffered 2, 3, even more. And there's also that anxiety about what's ahead of you. Are you going to have any more problems? So it was a lot of anxiety for sure.
And will you ever be able to have a baby? And I mean, the other thing that is, and I know you work with bereaved parents, and what's interesting about miscarriages is that I think that they can be very minimized because there isn't a physical child. So people can kind of minimize that. And I mean, with the husbands even more, with the dads even more. But did you get support? Did you find support around that? Or did you feel like people didn't really acknowledge your loss?
It was a little bit of both. I actually had some friends who had already had a miscarriage, and it was just so nice to be able to connect with somebody who had been through it. That was just so important for me. It made a huge difference. And then, of course, I ran into people who didn't quite understand. And there's a lot of people who just don't understand that for a lot of moms, the moment that you look at your pregnancy test, you start that attachment. And it's kind of hard to explain that. And when you have a miscarriage, it's the loss of that attachment you have in addition to like the loss of a dream. You'd spent the last however many weeks dreaming and thinking of the future. And even though I knew I wasn't in a safe place yet, I was already looking at nursery stuff and registry stuff. And there's just so much that you lose, and then telling people. And I did find it very therapeutic to talk about it, though. Anybody who checked in with me and anybody who would listen, I wanted to tell my story because it helped me feel like I was really validating my loss, and letting people know how important it was to me was important. And that kind of helped me too. But I think everybody has a personal journey with it too.
Well, you're making a really good point, because I think, and my mom and I have done shows about this, you're not just losing your pregnancy, you're losing the future you thought you were going to have. Like as soon as we get pregnant, we're thinking 9 months ahead. You're way ahead of the game, so you lose your future and the pregnancy.
Yeah. And, the one thing I do now too, now that I have 4 kids, and I was very lucky afterwards to not have any, I had some other issues come up, but nothing like that. And, we talk about the baby and we have a special ornament we put on the tree every year at Christmas, and they ask questions, and I made a little scrapbook when it happened and I show them. And it's really special. They actually ask me a lot of questions and they're very interested. So it is, a really touching, it's always sad to think about, but it's very touching to share it with my children too.
You know what really comes up for me when you talk about that, is that what a gift you're giving the children in letting them have more empathy for other people and that kind of an understanding, because sometimes people are reluctant to talk about the losses, and they don't realize that if they do talk about it, it really builds resilience for the kids and helps them to have empathy. Well, I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the most difficult thing for families in dealing with grief as a family unit?
It can range from person to person, but over the years, I think one of the most difficult things, of course, is the obvious, which is that isolation, just feeling like this is happening to you, but everybody else around you is moving forward, living life, not experiencing the pain, not fully understanding that type of pain that you can be in. And until families start meeting other people and form a community of, bereaved parents that they can go to, or at least some connections, it can just feel extremely isolating. And I think I hear that the most because, people come to me at first when they first experience the loss with just, questions like, is it normal that I feel this way? And, those typical questions, how am I going to survive this? Because, of that traumatic nature of such a loss of losing a child. So that would be one of my, and, again, it can range, but that's definitely one of the things that comes to mind when you ask that.
So Jessica, you facilitate peer-to-peer support groups virtually for people that have lost children, which I love because they're virtual, so people can join these groups. And my mom and I have always talked about, and we know from firsthand experience, how important peer-to-peer support is.
Yeah, in the last few years, because everybody started using Zoom groups more in 2020, we started creating more and more groups, and I do a grief book club, a grief writing group, 2 general grief support groups, and we're also starting a grief and resiliency group. So we just keep adding more groups, and they're going really well, and our community is building because more parents are finding us, and we're just finding that the virtual groups are a really good way to reach people because we're a national organization, and we don't do as much local stuff because we help parents in every state.
And this is for brain tumor.
This is for Children's Brain Tumor Foundation. Yes.
Specifically. So
Yeah.
book club, that's really interesting. What kind of books do you read for book club?
So what we did was we got tons of interest when I put this idea out there, and I have maybe like 25 to 30 bereaved parents that are in the group. And I gave people the opportunity to nominate books related to grief and self-care. And people came back to me, and then we voted on the books, and we do 6 books at a time. We're on our 2nd cycle now. And it's been really nice. We read the grief book or the self-care book for about 4 to 6 weeks. And then we get together on Zoom and we discuss it. And of course, parents are welcome to join, even if they haven't finished or read the book, but it's been really nice and lots of interest. And it automatically goes into a support group type of discussion too, because we're talking about grief and we're relating to it.
I'm kind of fascinated because with the internet, brain tumors are random around. You could live in a town and not have anybody else in a small town who had a brain tumor. So a child died of a brain tumor. And I think there's some specific issues connected with that. I would assume a lot of hospitalization. I don't know, all the details, but there must be a lot that they have in common, and as far as peer support goes.
They feel very connected with, and there's other, times where they're also connected with just parents who've lost a child to illness, but the brain tumor population is very specific because depending on where the brain tumor was, they can already be experiencing a lot of losses, a lot of changes before a death happens. So they've already been going through that. And then just watching what their child goes through and the intense treatment that many of them need and the surgeries, it's really hard. So they do feel very bonded and connected to each other.
how do you start to become resilient? I mean, is there a starting point, or what would you say to people out there that feel like they're ready to move in that direction?
Just to be clear, the resiliency part is really focused on the functioning. The resiliency for functioning is where our focus really is. So,
Getting out of bed in the morning.
yeah, and
Oh,
being able to find those moments of joy and what can you do? Healthy distraction, all of those, and we're using skill sets taught by positive psychology too. And we never want to, we always want to validate the pain of grief, of course, and of course, the mom I'm co-facilitating this with fully understands that there's certain things that we can't, treat or change about grief. It's more of how can we live our fullest life possible while grieving, and how can we get to that point, and how can we help that process? I think, really building in general, anybody in life can always be building their resiliency already before you go through. And if you've already gone through something, of course, you can too. But, just finding those things, those healthy distractions that make you feel joy already helps building that up, and incorporating those habits into your life, whether it's, exercise, music, yoga, whatever it is, doing what you can, setting aside time for yourself. And also with grief, taking a moment, the whole mindfulness approach of, letting your feelings come and flow through you and having time to focus on them. And also knowing when it's okay to distract yourself and not focus on them all day. I think it's always a balance, right? Between
mhm.
there might be days where you just have to think about it all day and you can't get out of bed. I think eventually parents do come to the point where they tell themselves, okay, I'm going to take this time to grieve, but then I need to get out of bed and keep moving forward, or do something else, or go to my healthy distraction. So I think, in connections, human connection is huge with resiliency.
Mhm. Peer
Um,
support.
yeah, peer support, and also just having relationships in your life that bring you joy.
Mm.
And if you can have those before, if you have a community build up, that always seems to help parents. Of course, there's going to be people who offer the type of support that they like more than others do. But in general, just I think, human connection, they always say, right, is one of the biggest parts of life that can keep you going through.
I love that, Jessica. And I heard something once which helped me. I always thought everybody needed to show up and give me support the way that I wanted it, in talking about my brother and validating, acknowledging, and being there. But we have some friends out there that are there to distract us and to be fun
Yeah.
and to play with us and to give us a break from our grief.
Yeah.
So people serve different reasons. And you also said something which my mom and I are always talking about. It's a balance. It's like we want to validate and acknowledge how painful and horrible it is to lose a child and a sibling and a grandchild, but yet we also want to have people hold on to hope that things will shift a little bit and get a little easier. So it's kind of like a dance we're constantly doing, right? Back and forth with the validation,
Mhm.
and then moving towards resilience, but validating how hard it is and finding a new normal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we'll say not just a child too, losing a spouse. We're talking about family
Yes,
grief. That's huge, because if you lose a spouse, your kids lose a parent, and
yeah,
it's a big, big picture for everybody. So this
that's true.
resilience, yeah. I think one thing that's important too is to learn. I found for myself in both my son's death and my husband's death, is to let other people help you. I mean,
Yeah.
I've had to learn that over time. I think particularly when you're younger, you're used to helping other people and doing it. And when you've had a loss, you want to feel like you're really competent.
Mhm.
And I found that I became even, when my son died, I was teaching at the University of Rochester, and I became almost like doing more than I'd ever done before. It was like, I got to show that I can keep it together, that I've got it together. So I think you have to be careful that you don't become overconfident, that you don't overwork, that you don't overshow people. Oh, I can do the shopping. You don't need to pick my kids up. I can take care of my family, or, my husband's not here, but I can take care of all the finances. I can do everything. Rather than that, letting people help you. I mean, just having somebody hold your baby or something, come over and play with my kids for an hour. I mean, just
Yep.
those small things, and people want to do it, but sometimes you
Mhm.
do have to sometimes ask for it.
Yeah, those little small things can become very hard, especially, that first the first few years sometimes, and especially of course the first few weeks and months. And it's definitely okay to let people come in and help you. And that's a really great point.
And ask.
Yep.
And if people are listening who've had a family member who's had a death, just go do some things, go show up.
This comes up all the time in our groups. Like, what happens when a friend isn't there for you in the way that you want them to be, but they're a really good friend and you don't want them, to be out of your life. And we talk about how we can respectfully communicate with these people too, because some people just really do want to know how can they help and they don't know what to do. And some people are nervous. They might be thinking, am I going to be intrusive if I show up at their door? Are they going to be annoyed with me if I call and try to support them? And, some people really do want to help, but they just kind of don't know what to do. And there are times where I think respectful communication can help in telling people what you need and how you're feeling. And it might not work for everybody depending on, the personality, the friend, individual things, but some people have had success in doing that and have kind of saved relationships or felt less angry afterwards. So
I think that's really important, Jessica, because sometimes we do, like you said, have to teach people how to be good grief support. I mean, people aren't psychic. And, sometimes we expect them to kind of know, can't they read our body language? Don't they know what I want? But some people don't know. And like you said, they want to show up for us in the right ways, but they're not sure how, and they don't want to be too intrusive. And so I like that point of telling people what you need.
yeah, and people are always raised differently too in terms of how to deal with grief. Some people have been more open about it in their families and some people have not. So that can also, put them in a confused spot when they're trying to support somebody else who's grieving because they might not know how to handle it.
And I have to say it, but some people are toxic. There may be some people you won't want to see for a while, or they
boundaries
break you down and you can't handle it, and you lose friends. I think you probably lost some friends, didn't you, Heidi, that weren't supportive?
Yes, because some of my friends felt like I should be over it in a pretty short period of time. And you don't get over a loss, you learn to live with it. And they wanted me to return to the old Heidi really quickly. And they weren't tolerant of the fact that it takes a long time to grieve. When you've lost your brother, it's a process.
When to set that boundary and knowing, what you can and can't handle and what's okay, what's good for you in your grief process. So yes, exactly. That exact situation comes up and is talked about all the time with my family.
My husband died 3 years ago, and I was dating, and I had people who couldn't handle it. So, there are couples I know, or people who were loyal to my husband who felt like this wasn't what I should be doing. So they were making judgments for me. And I think we have to be careful. We have to grieve and do what we do.
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, there was friends that you lost that you were friends with as a couple, but once you became someone that was widowed and single, they were no longer, they didn't show up for you the way that they used to.
Yeah.
Hard. It's hard to deal
So,
with.
if you had some advice to give to people who recently had a loss and family members, what would it be?
Wow. I mean, there's so many tips I could share that I've learned over the years. But I think, doing whatever reading that you can do, or talking to a professional, or just talking to other people who've been through it, so that you can have realistic expectations for yourself, to not put so much pressure on yourself and to not let other people put pressure on you. The majority of the time what you're going through is typical and expected. It's just an extremely hard loss many times, to kind of know what your limits are. And, if you feel like you can't function, that's when you seek support. And also to seek those, like I said, those human connections, the people that can bring you joy and be there for you in different ways, like Heidi said, to find other people who've been through it. That's always my number one piece of advice, because I've heard, since 2004, I've been working for bereaved families, and that's always their number one, almost always the number one thing they say is talking to other parents who've been through it, or talking to other people who've been through my type of loss. So, I do see, I work with some parents, and some of them are just trying all kinds of different support to see what works for them. And that would be another really good tip I have is, sometimes talking's not for everybody. Sometimes therapy is not for everybody. Sometimes support groups not for everybody, but try different things and find what is helpful to you. Because if you can find that, that's how you can meet your community and get that support that you personally need.
That's great. Well, how do people find you?
So I work for Children's Brain Tumor Foundation. So if you've experienced the loss of a child to a brain or spinal cord tumor, you can always reach out to me or to anybody in our foundation. And as a private therapist, I work for Revive Counseling and Wellness in Scottsdale, Arizona, and I'm on their website.
And do you do online
Yeah,
counseling?
I can do online. Yep.
Well, thank you, Jessica, for all the work you're doing. It's amazing. And good luck with that big family.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you so much for talking today and for having me.
Thanks so much, Jessica, and thank you for everything that you're doing for grieving families.
Thank you, Heidi. Thanks for all of your support.
And we want to thank everybody for joining us on this show. And Heidi and I always want to remind you that if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own. And God bless.
I'm Dr. Heidi Horsley. You have been listening to Open to Hope, the podcast. You can follow Open to Hope on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To learn more, visit us at opentohope.com and go to Apple Podcasts to subscribe.
I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley. Join us again next week for another Open to Hope conversation, where we invite you to lean on our hope until you find your own.